Okay, good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where your time zone is. Welcome to the virtual component of the 20th Annual TCOM Conference. I'm glad you could all make it. Hope you have a good time. If you have questions, comments, concerns, please reach out and we will help you address them. I am here to introduce to you someone who I think you're going to enjoy, Dr. Elizabeth Riley. So Elizabeth is a assistant professor of assistant research professor of public health at the University of Kentucky, and she is a psychologist by training. And what she focuses on, she works with our safe systems team here, and she focuses on data advocacy and data communication within the workforce development space. Now, you know people who speak in words, you know people who speak in sentences, and then there's this rare group of people who can actually speak in paragraphs. And Elizabeth is one of those individuals, so I think you're going to very much enjoy Elizabeth's discussion of safety science in workplace culture. So thank you, Elizabeth, for joining us, and we look forward to hearing your wisdom.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, John. It's a very kind introduction. It's really wonderful to be here with all of you. As John mentioned, I'm Elizabeth Riley. I work with the Safe Systems team, and what I'll be talking through today is sort of the impact and work that our team does to advance a safety culture, predominantly in a child welfare workforce. And so a lot of the work that we do is in public child welfare, but we've also done and expanded this work in other sort of public helping systems. We really focus on the public sector and what that looks like, predominantly in behavioral and mental health, but we've also done some work in kind of fire EMS. We've done some work in law enforcement around this area. So it really is a broadly applicable body of work, and would love to answer any questions about how that might look in other sectors if that's of interest to people. Ari, our wonderful moderator, will be moderating the chat. If you have any clarifying questions, if I forget to define something, please pop that in the chat. I'm happy to answer those, but we'll also try to leave some room for discussion at the very end. So I will go ahead and share my slides. I also will share a slightly modified version of this deck with Ari following the talk that you're able to download and kind of look through. Please email me or anyone on our team with questions that you have about this work. I'll also give a little bit of a plug to our YouTube channel. We've got a lot of videos on that channel. There's actually a series that's called, I think it's called Safe Systems Shorts, that actually defines a lot of the work that we're doing. It talks about critical incident review, talks about some of the concepts. So a lot of this will be a pretty high level tour of the work that we do over the next 30 minutes, but I would really encourage you to go to the YouTube channel if you'd like some more information, some more in-depth information on some of these pieces. All right, so go ahead and get started. A lot of the work that I'll be talking about today in terms of advancing a safety culture in child welfare revolves around or is centered in what's called the National Partnership for Child Safety, or NPCS. I may refer to it as the partnership, kind of partnership with a capital P. That's sort of what we're referring to. The National Partnership of Child Safety is a peer-to-peer learning collaborative of about 40 public child welfare systems around the country. So we have included in the partnership really large county-based systems like LA County, or kind of tribal nations like Spirit Lake Nation. We also have statewide systems like Kentucky or Tennessee or Indiana. I'll show a map here in a second. But really the mission of this partnership and collaborative is to improve child safety and prevent child maltreatment related fatalities by using the sciences of safety, improvement, and implementation. So safety science, improvement science, and implementation science. As John mentioned earlier, I'm a clinical psychologist by training, but have always had a really strong interest and kind of dedication towards advancing public systems using implementation science. So that's a lot of the principles that guide my work. So here is a map of the current partners in the National Partnership for Child Safety, and Ari's going to pop a link in the chat. That's just the website for the partnership in case you'd like some more information just about what we do. But there are four kind of main core activities that sort of guide the partnership's work. The first is to, and I'll go through each of these in a little bit more detail and talk about how we advance this concept of safety science and safety culture. The first is to really learn and promote a systems-focused review of critical incidences that occur in the child welfare system. These incidences, which typically are fatalities or near fatalities that occur within these systems, are highly impactful, and they often have an outsized impact on the workforce and workplace culture. These events are fortunately rare within any given system, but they have a really high impact. And so being able to treat an incident like that when it occurs from a learning perspective and from a systems perspective is crucially really important to the health and safety, not just of the workforce, but also of the children and families served in that system. Another piece that we do kind of adjacent to that is that everyone in the partnership commits not only to learning and conducting those systems focused review process, but also to sharing their data from critical incidents, which I mentioned are typically child fatalities and near fatalities, into a large national database. So this database is similar to other databases that you might see in healthcare, aviation, where people are sharing critical incident reviews from a systems perspective to try to learn from those as a field. This first occurred in the healthcare field, where hospitals all around the country would share data around a critical incident like a wrong side surgery or a foreign body left in the abdomen following a surgery, something that fortunately happens really rarely in any one hospital, but because it's only happening once a year, once every 5 years, that makes it really hard to learn from. It makes it really hard to understand, okay, what were the systems factors that happened in the life of this case that led to this really bad outcome? We take a similar approach in child welfare to try to understand what happens from a systems perspective as people are learning and sharing these critical incident reviews. The second thing that we do in the partnership is, that's a funny little, this word study is really small, I'm sorry about that. We do an organizational assessment in many of the jurisdictions that we work with to study and improve workplace culture. So I'll talk about that in a little bit as well, but that's also a pretty standardized process around the partnership. And then finally, we really try to take a peer-to-peer learning model for how to shift the culture of child welfare agencies. Within the partnership, we have a number of affinity groups, work groups, kind of dissemination groups around data and best practices, because this process of advancing safety science and safety culture in the workplace is pretty new for child welfare and pretty new for public systems generally. And so we always use the phrase, we're building the plane as we're flying it. We're all trying to learn together about how we can best advance a safety culture in child welfare. So I've said the word safety culture probably 15 times in the last 5 minutes, but what actually is a safety culture? So a safety culture is really foundational in systems that are both high risk and make high consequence decisions. So the concept of a safety culture and safety science really originates from the engineering fields, something like nuclear power or manufacturing or healthcare, where the decisions that individual people are making are really high risk and where you can't learn by failure. Child welfare is very similar in the sense that the decisions that child welfare professionals are making on a day-to-day basis are high risk. They also have really high impact to the children and families that they serve. It's another system where in child welfare, you cannot learn by failure. If you remember, the mission of the partnership is to really try to understand and decrease the number of child maltreatment related fatalities. That's a really high risk type of decision making. And so promoting a culture that really treats bad outcomes as learning opportunities, that really tries to take a systems approach towards accountability is really crucial for this field to ever improve. Organizations that embrace a safety culture also really emphasize this idea of blameless candor and respect, in the sense that we treat mistakes as learning opportunities, we treat near misses as learning opportunities, and that people are able to report their errors or near misses without a fear of reprimand or punishment, knowing that that is going to make the system better. I'll talk a little bit about this understanding of accountability, sort of individual compared to systems accountability, because that's always something that people are thinking about when they're thinking about safety culture. But really one of the key components of a safety culture is treating mistakes and treating bad outcomes as learning opportunities. And finally, agencies that embrace a safety culture commit to sharing resources to advance safety. Something we talk about a lot is that you can always identify a system's priorities by figuring out where they're dedicating their resources, both their financial and their time resources. And so organizations who really embrace a safety culture commit resources to advancing the culture of their agency. They also commit to sort of this really intense collaboration across ranks and disciplines, this understanding that the commissioner of a child welfare system has a really important perspective. The caseworker that's only been there for 18 months also has a really important perspective. And so increasing that ability to collaborate across ranks and disciplines is a crucial part of safety culture. So I mentioned that we talk a lot about accountability in the concept of a safety culture. So in terms of accountability, we think about it as sort of existing on a spectrum where you can have a retributive approach to accountability that really is concerned with rules, rule breaking, and sanctions. We ask in these kinds of settings sort of who broke which rule, how serious is the violation, and how should they be punished. Something is paid back or something is owed in that concept. And so this traditionally has been really the culture of child welfare, especially in the last 10 years or so. Things have shifted, but prior to that, it was a really blame and shame focused system and sort of culture, this idea that when you did something wrong, someone needed to be punished. On the other side, that's much more in line with a safety culture, is a restorative approach to accountability that's much more concerned with learning and assumes complexities within systems. We say all the time, you can't fire your way into a better system if the system's problems still persist. If there's a reason why that caseworker or child welfare professional made a decision that ended up in a bad outcome, if the system's issues are never fixed, things like turnover, things like low case or high caseload, things like high acuity of caseloads, if those things are never addressed, you're just going to perpetuate those problems with newer caseworkers. And again, you're never going to fire your way into a better system. There are sometimes very small instances where, of course, individual accountability needs to be addressed, but we operate under the assumption that for the vast majority of cases, accountability needs to sit at the systems level, and we need to understand it from a restorative approach, asking questions like who was harmed, what do they need, and whose responsibility is it to provide help. One of the directions that we're really taking our work right now is trying to understand that child welfare does not exist in a vacuum. Child welfare is a part of a network of helping systems, thinking about first responders, thinking about the education system, thinking about health departments. Child welfare exists within a network. And so this understanding of like whose responsibility is it to provide help is not only about the child welfare system, but it's about this larger network of helping systems as well. Two foundational concepts that we'll sort of reference here, and again, both of these have their own little YouTube videos, so I'd really encourage you to go watch those. One is psychological safety. This is a term that you may have heard before. Google did a big study on this, a big press release, so psychological safety has come a little bit of a buzzword now, but psychological safety, the way that we understand it and the way that we really define it in our work, is that it's a shared belief held by team members, so it's a team-based concept that it's okay to take risks, express concerns and ideas, ask questions, and admit mistakes without fear of punishment or retribution. It asks questions about, do you feel accepted, respected, part of a team? Can you ask questions? Can you bring up concerns and challenges in a way that may be uncomfortable? Psychological safety is not the same as comfort, but at the end of the day, it is a safe environment to do that, and your team feels like a place that would treat those questions, concerns, and mistakes from a learning perspective. So psychological safety is really about how a team feels together. Mindful organizing is all about how a team behaves. And so this talks about the ways in which teams monitor, plan, innovate, and support one another. Do you talk about your mistakes? Do you defer to the expertise of people within your team? And do you dedicate resources to testing change? The three main activities, I talked about this a little bit at the beginning, but the three main activities in the National Partnership for Child Safety are systems-focused critical incident review and that the data sharing that goes along with that, the organizational assessment to study and improve culture, teaming strategies you can think about things like huddles or debriefs or handovers that have been evidenced in other systems, of other safety critical systems, and that we're now taking to child welfare. And all of those are sort of underlined by this concept of peer-to-peer learning, that the state of Kentucky is learning from the state of Indiana and how they conduct their critical incident reviews. LA County is learning from New York City and how they implement huddles. And, the data from the organizational assessment is actually combined into a partnership-wide data set of over 20,000 data points from child welfare professionals around the country. So even though each individual jurisdiction in the partnership is sort of on their own journey for how to implement each of these three parts of the core activities, they're all really kind of foundationally learning together and learning from one another to how to best advance that safety culture within their system. So the systems-focused critical incident review in child welfare is really the first activity that most jurisdictions undertake in the partnership. As I mentioned before, in most of these systems, critical incidents like fatalities are pretty rare. But in the past, they've been treated from a really punitive perspective. Often the child welfare director would get fired. It would kind of drive the workforce underground, and people would be less likely to report errors, mistakes, or concerns that really occurred within a blaming environment. In a systems-focused critical incident review, we really work to collect data and understand what happened using a sort of root cause analysis type of thinking, using debriefings that are supportive, non-punitive, and really focused on learning. The Safe Systems Improvement Tool is a communimetric tool that our team uses that treats these systems-focused critical incident reviews as a root cause analysis to try to understand what, from a systems perspective, happened in the life of this case, in the life of this children and families' experience with child welfare, to try to understand where were some of the service gaps between what the family needed and what they received from the system. The priority, as with all communimetric tools, is for the data to be communicated well, to really understand the story of a professional. So unlike the cans or the ANSA, where you may be trying to understand the story of a child or a family, here you're really trying to understand the story of the professional and understand what they did in that case, where they understood some of those service gaps to be, and to try to then output that into a standard review process. The focus of the standard review process is to then take cases or reviews that might look really different on the surface. So you might think of an infant that dies from an unsafe sleep-related fatality and aggregate the learnings from that review and from those systems with a review of a child that died as a result of homicide, who was maybe a 13-year-old that died as a result of homicide. On the surface, those two cases look really different, but they may have some of the same systems findings and system service gaps that we can then identify in an aggregated form across the partnership. We think about this phrase a lot, that the outcomes are rare, but the problems are not. We will often, good casework can result in bad outcomes, and oftentimes in bad casework, we stumble into good outcomes. And so we really try to understand this not from a sort of hindsight bias focus on, the outcome defines the casework, but to really try to understand the casework as sort of outcome neutral and knowing that there are problems in all casework that we can identify by using these really high-profile incidents. This is an example or just sort of a screenshot of some of the domains of the SSIT. We have a lot of resources for the SSIT if you're interested in learning a little bit more about the tool, but it's structured very much like the CANs, which I'm sure many are familiar with. This idea that you are both rating each of these items in terms of proximity and urgency for quality improvement. And then we also have, similar to the CANs, there's a prompt for narrative data to be included and written about when one of these areas of case practice is identified as being really proximal to the outcome of the case. So this is, there we go. So the team first assessment of safety culture, we will often call it the organizational assessment or the survey, is that other piece in the second piece in one of those three core activities of the national partnership. So the team first assessment of safety culture, or the task, is a survey that we send to all employees, all staff identified as working within a particular child welfare jurisdiction. We ask things about personal and workforce demographics, like agency or department tenure, job type. We also ask about personal demographics like race, gender, age, in order to really try to understand how people of different identities and intersectionalities experience safety culture. That's why we ask those questions. We also have some standard safety culture scales that we ask in every single administration of the task across the partnership. So these are things like mindful organizing, psychological safety, workplace connectedness, emotional exhaustion, intent to remain employed at the agency. And so we actually have data on this across the entire country. It's the largest database of child welfare professionals in the country. And we also have kind of agency practice, individual agency practice. This is not considered standard in a part of our scales, but we will often ask individual jurisdictions questions and scales that might be particularly related to their case practice at the time. So some of the data that we see pretty consistently throughout the partnership are these connections and associations between those two really foundational concepts, mindful organizing and psychological safety, and outcomes that we really care about. So with increasing psychological safety, you see within systems, both cross-sectionally and over time, you see increased workforce retention and decreased emotional exhaustion. With mindful organizing as well, with increasing mindful organizing, you see increasing workplace connectedness and decreasing emotional exhaustion. We really highlight emotional exhaustion because it's a huge driver of turnover. And so we always are really paying attention to how these team culture elements can really buffer against the development of emotional exhaustion, eventually leading to turnover. Some early data from our work in the partnership would indicate that these scales that we measure consistently over time, with sustained membership in the partnership, jurisdictions experience increases, especially in mindful organizing, in all of the scales that we really care about. So we see increases in workplace connectedness, we see huge jumps in mindful organizing, and increases in psychological safety with sustained membership in the partnership. This blue bar over here is sort of wave 1 of people's membership in the partnership. This yellow bar here is wave 2. Similarly, we see decreases in emotional exhaustion with sustained membership in the partnership, and increases in, this stands for intent to remain employed in child welfare, which is our turnover proxy. You want to see increases here, and we do. We see increases with sustained membership in the partnership in intent to remain employed in child welfare. So this data is really interesting, certainly, because it's nearly 20,000 child welfare professionals just in this slice of the data here. But it's also really validating because a lot of what we focus on with sustained membership in the partnership is the development of mindful organizing. It's that development and sort of maintenance around psychological safety. So that's something that we're always really excited to see. The last thing that I'll spend a little bit of time talking about is the Team First Field Guide of Strategies. So if you remember the task, that survey data that I just got finished talking about, it's called the Team First Assessment of Safety Culture. And now we have the Team First Field Guide around safety culture. The strategies that we identify in the field guide here are really closely tied to the constructs and subscales of the survey itself, especially mindful organizing and safety culture. So we focus a lot on those two concepts, especially early on for jurisdictions in the partnership, because they're so foundational. So we take an implementation science framework when we're thinking about implementing some of these changes for a particular jurisdiction, to try to be mindful of both the interest for that particular jurisdiction and their capacity for change. So what I mean by that is, if a jurisdiction is really interested in improving the mindful organizing scores and mindful organizing practices for a particular team or area office within their jurisdiction, there's a lot of things that they could do. There's a lot of strategies that we know show evidence for improving mindful organizing. But there may be one area office that simply does not have the capacity to do a full-scale implementation of huddles for every child removal in their entire system. That's a pretty big undertaking. And so that's where this concept of implementation science really comes in, when we think about, okay, you're interested in mindful organizing, that's wonderful. We have a lot of strategies. We also need to be really mindful of what your capacity for change is. So area office A might be really well equipped to do a full-scale implementation implementation of huddles to improve the way that they treat their work practices. Area Office B may not, and they may need to do something a little bit more straightforward, like asking a question around teaming following a huddle. So the last thing I'll really talk about is this idea of huddles, and this is the last slide I've got before we'll have some conversation for if anyone has questions. We always like to spotlight huddles because huddles have a really strong evidence base in other systems for improving mindful organizing practices. We say all the time that the culture of a team, the culture of an agency lives in the habits and the way that you solve problems, and a huddle is a really good example of a way that you can both build a team habit and solve some problems. A huddle is a really brief, action-oriented meeting. We often tell people it needs to be a stand-up meeting that's really focused on a particular casework practice. It's focused on organizing yourselves around something really specific. We know that higher huddle effectiveness is significantly predicted by workplace connectedness and higher psychological safety, such that the existence of that strong teamwork in a particular team will predict how effective a huddle is. But the existence of huddles will also then predict increases in mindful organizing over time. There's a little bit of a difference between how teams treat a huddle in terms of whether you're just doing it or whether you're really being intentional about centering mindful organizing and centering psychological safety in your huddle. But we know that both using huddles and using huddles well predicts increases in mindful organizing and psychological safety over time. So that's an example of one of those strategies. Again, we've got a lot of more in-depth information for those strategies on the YouTube channel and in the link that Ari shared. But with that, I will pause now, see if there's any questions, thoughts. I know that was a whirlwind tour of safety culture and child welfare, but I hope it gave you a little bit of a taste of some of the work that we do and encourages and inspires you to ask more.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. Are you able to see the chat, or do you want me to share the questions with you?
I can see them. Let's see. Good stuff. Hey, Scott, good to see you again. What are good strategies to neutralize an agency or district's tendency to move away from a safety culture in the name of protecting against lawsuits? That is a phenomenal question. So one of the things that we think about a lot is this sort of fear that child welfare directors or agency directors very understandably have around sharing the data. I will say that the sharing of this kind of vulnerable data takes a lot of vulnerability from a child welfare director because there are no federal protections around that data. Something that we do that we really leverage around the partnership is treating the partnership as sort of the gold standard for understanding and sharing this data. So the partnership will often, and again, I know that this is kind of specific to public child welfare, which is not your area, but I think that one of the pieces that we really rely on quite a bit is thinking about the partnership as where people really need to focus. The partnership, including the co-chairs, will often publish op-eds or byline, different pieces that talk about the importance of safety culture. We've not ever had in the partnership a request for that kind of data or people coming after the data itself, but we also, because there are no federal protections around it right now, we keep it pretty closely locked down in the sense that we keep it sort of within the partnership, really learning focused as opposed to releasing individual data.
Thanks.
Yeah, for sure. I really like the huddle. Other steps to hand off incoming commissioners. Yes. So, hey, Ken, it's good to see you again. So that's a great thing. So a lot of what we do in the partnership when there's a new commissioner or a new director in one of the partnership jurisdictions is to try to get on their calendar and meet with them within the first couple of months to talk about what is safety culture? Why is it important? We as the UK team are happy to meet with them, but it's so much more helpful to hear from other child welfare commissioners. So we'll often rely on our co-chairs who are from Connecticut and Franklin County, Ohio right now, or other kind of child welfare leaders in similar states or in similar positions to really talk about how the membership in the partnership has impacted the culture of their agency. So we really try to do warm handoffs both with the UK team to orient them to everything they get through membership in the partnership or with other child welfare directors in similar situations. Yes, institutional memory is something that all of us are fighting all of the time. I know, and that kind of turnover is just really tough. And that's why we say, the culture lives in the habits and the way that we solve problems is trying to infuse it as a part of just standard agency practice is key, but it's also really hard.
Did you see Paul Davis from Washington? Is there a version for behavioral health, or could you modify it?
Yeah, absolutely. So that Paul, I'd love to talk with you about that. Please feel free to email me. But I think it would work really, really well in behavioral health because a lot of this work actually comes from hospitals and healthcare settings initially. So it's a really natural fit there. But we'd be glad to do that. We do implementations of this survey in other sectors, public sectors, and we're also doing implementation over in TCOM Italia right now. So very exciting.
Thanks, appreciate it. I think that just like I'm sure other states, it feels like we're losing a lot of behavioral health folks, but I don't think we've got it quantified. And I think your questions prompt an opportunity to see, well, what's happening.
Definitely. And for anyone that's interested, on the partnership website, and I'm happy to just email this to you as well, Paul, we have all of the scales, all the questions that we typically use, and then also kind of add-ins for that organizational assessment. Can be really helpful in just getting a lay of the land, especially to Ken's point, especially for new commissioners or new directors, either in child welfare spaces or in agencies, to really sort of come in, say, I really want to get to know my agency, get to know my department. Where are we sitting? Where are some of the really areas of celebration? Where are maybe some of the problem areas? And how can we infuse that into our strategic plan?